Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be taking a really close, impartial look at a recent Sky News Australia broadcast. Why? Because unpacking exactly how political commentators are framing U.S. foreign policy and domestic media friction is absolutely crucial right now. Whether you're a total political junkie or just trying to make sense of today's wild geopolitical landscape, understanding how different media ecosystems frame the news is, well, it's vital. Today, we're diving into a specific right-wing perspective, examining their arguments on everything from European defense to domestic media battles. So let's get right into it. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at diplomatic moves in Rubio. Second, questioning NATO's modern purpose. Third, Trump's populist appeal. And fourth, media polarization and punditry. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, diplomatic moves and Marco Rubio, and all that growing 2028 speculation. The broadcast zones in on Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his recent trip to the Vatican. They make a point to note that his friendly, constructive meeting with Pope Francis is happening at a really critical time. We're talking about a moment characterized by some pretty wild tensions between President Trump and European leaders. It's a fascinating juxtaposition, right? You've got this high-stakes political friction on one hand, and then this very traditional, stabilizing diplomacy on the other. And this perfectly captures how these commentators view Rubio. They essentially see him as this highly visible figure who's constantly riding to the rescue to smooth things over. Whether he's doing a White House briefing or visiting the Pope, they frame him as the go-to official stepping in to clean up the administration's rhetoric. And they emphasize that he's doing a really effective job at it, which is heavily fueling voter speculation about his own political ambitions for a 2028 presidential run. Basically, they're telling their audience, hey, watch this space. Moving right along to Section 2, questioning NATO's modern purpose, where we'll analyze the recent troop withdrawal from Germany.
So the catalyst for this entire discussion is the Pentagon's announcement that the U.S. is pulling 5,000 troops out of German territory. It's a sudden reduction, and European nations were reportedly not even consulted beforehand. Naturally, this prompted immediate pushback from European leaders. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, for instance, explicitly stated she absolutely does not support the removal of U.S. troops from Europe.
But listen to how guest Josh Hammer reframes the math on this. He points out that the U.S. previously had roughly 37,000 troops stationed in Germany. Take away 5,000, and that still leaves 32,000 troops sitting there. Hammer argues that instead of agonizing over why 5,000 troops are leaving, a rational, reasonable observer should actually be asking why 32,000 troops are still there in the first place. You see what he did there? He completely flips the baseline assumption of the whole debate. And that brings us straight to the core thesis of their foreign policy argument. Hammer poses a profound skepticism toward the alliance's modern relevance with one big question: what is NATO in the year 2026? He asks this directly, stating, quite frankly, that he genuinely does not know what the answer is or what the U.S. actually gets out of the relationship, especially considering America provides the overwhelming majority of the resources. To back up the skepticism, the commentators take a quick walk through NATO's history. They note it was founded back in 1949 to keep Soviet expansion in check. Then, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the total dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. So their argument is super straightforward. NATO's literal reason for existing was accomplished 3.5 decades ago. They argue the alliance definitely deserves praise for that past victory, but they seriously question why it still needs such a massive presence today. So the crucial takeaway here is their proposed pivot. The commentators are explicitly arguing that the U.S. needs to shift away from these Eurocentric alliance structures. Why? Well, even though they acknowledge Vladimir Putin is a, quote, very bad man, they view Russia as somewhat of a paper tiger that's proven deeply ineffective on the battlefield in Ukraine. Instead, they argue the U.S. absolutely must pivot to confront what they see as the real major threat. They label China and the Chinese Communist Party in the Indo-Pacific as the #1 threat of this century. Guest Jeff Kruer then adds another pretty provocative economic layer to this critique. He brings up what we can call the cradle-to-grave argument. Basically, Kruer argues that U.S. defense spending is effectively propping up rich European nations, allowing them to fund generous cradle-to-grave socialist states for their citizens. In his view, the only reason these European countries can afford such massive social safety nets is because the American taxpayer is footing the bill for their military defense. Because of this, he strongly advocates for President Trump to accelerate those troop withdrawals and just end that dynamic entirely. All right, moving from international policy over to domestic personality, we hit Section 3, Trump's populist appeal, where we look at the politics of personality and showmanship. Let's look at how the broadcast explains his appeal. The hosts actually use recent footage of Trump dancing at the White House with students to analyze his very unique political skill set. They point out that this so-called Trump dance has completely transcended politics. It's become this universal cultural symbol, right? You literally have NFL players doing it in the end zone after scoring touchdowns. The hosts attribute this kind of massive cultural penetration to his background as a TV star, a real estate mogul, and a best-selling author. They argue his showmanship, his humor, and his infectious charisma forge a bond with his base that they honestly haven't seen since Ronald Reagan. They argue he just puts his supporters in a good mood, which is a soft skill they see as totally unmatched by his political opponents. Which brings us to our fourth and final section, media polarization and punditry, analyzing the ongoing media meltdown and the intense friction between right-wing commentators and left-leaning legacy media. To illustrate this huge media divide, the broadcast plays a clip of former MSNBC host Joy Reid. In the clip, she contrasts Trump with Vice President J.D. Vance. She dismisses Trump as a self-absorbed goof who's just seeking revenge and trying to get rich off Bitcoin schemes. But Vance? Reid views Vance as a genuinely frightening, calculated threat. She says he has complex views and would purposefully implement the controversial Project 2025 agenda, unlike Trump, who might just do it by accident. Now let's look at exactly how the Sky News guests counterattack this narrative. First off, they just dismiss Reid entirely. They mock her recent departure from the network and label her joyless and delusional. Next, they defend Project 2025. They call it perplexing that liberals are so scared of it, describing it as just standard handiwork from the Heritage Foundation, a very traditional conservative think tank. They also fiercely accuse Reid of hypocrisy. They argue that while she's out there fearing Trump might seek retribution, she's completely ignoring what they view as the Biden-Harris administration weaponizing the DOJ, specifically pointing to Merrick Garland and Jack Smith, to maliciously prosecute and bankrupt their political opposition. Finally, they forecast that this kind of legacy media behavior is never going to stop, predicting they will inherently demonize literally any Republican candidate who emerges for 2028. To explain this intense media dynamic, the commentators lean heavily on the term TDS, or Trump derangement syndrome. They use this pejorative term to describe what they view as an absolute, irrational obsession among liberal pundits. Their argument is that these media figures are just so consumed by their hatred of Donald Trump that they can't view any political event without filtering it through a lens of rage. In the commentators' eyes, this renders the legacy media's analysis completely incoherent. And to really hammer home what they see as the legacy media's total disconnect from everyday American voters, guest Josh Hammer points to one ultimate metric: the number 7. He notes that despite all the dire media warnings and all the legal prosecutions, Donald Trump still won all 7 swing states in the 2024 election. For these commentators, that number 7 is the absolute ultimate vindication of their worldview over the legacy media's narrative. As we wrap up this explainer, we can see a really clear picture of how this specific media ecosystem frames the world. It's a hard pivot away from traditional European alliances, a deep embrace of Trump's populist cultural appeal, and a fierce, unyielding war with legacy media narratives. But it leaves us with an incredibly compelling final thought. Think about this. If foreign policy is drastically shifting and our media polarization is only deepening as we look toward 2028, where do everyday voters actually go to find common ground? It's a crucial question to ponder as these deep institutional divides just continue to widen. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the framing of the media you consume.